Hello everyone. Today we have MiDiGo webinar August 2023, and we are hosting today Professor Dr. Anna Kristeva. I would like to introduce her. And first, actually, she is the founder and director of CERMES Center for Refugees, Migration, and Ethnic Studies. And also, she is the head of the Policy and Citizens Observatory, and she is a professor at the Department of Political Science at the New Bulgarian University. And currently, she is the team leader in the EU project Migration for Work project. And also, she is the editor in chief of the Southeastern Europe Journal. She has authored a lot of and also edited a lot of books and published more than 100 articles in about 20 countries. And her main field of research and teaching are migration and refugee policies and politics and far-right populism and citizenship and civic mobilization. So huge, interesting topics. And welcome to our webinar, Professor Anna Kristeva.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and pleasure being with you and your audience.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, she will present today a presentation webinar titled Balkan Migration Crisis and Beyond. And we are now, I would like to make her presentation time. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. First slide. Here is Serbia. Whether it is a war, sanctions, Kosovo, it mostly works the same way. People say the crisis in Serbia, it is not the crisis, it is simply Serbia. I like very much this quotation from a Serbian refugee in Belgrade, and with my students, we enjoy ourselves in counting how many Serbians there are in the Balkans. I think we could enlarge and count how many Serbia are in Europe and beyond. If I start with this nice provocative question, it is because it transfers three major messages of this paper. So the first one is the omnipresence and the multiplicity of crises in the Balkans. Second, the systemic affinity between crisis and migration. And the third equally important message is how embedded all crises, but also migration crises, are in national identities of the Balkan states. The article or the paper, it is published already, that's why it is both an article and a presentation, has a triple objective. First, to conceptualize the migration crisis in an innovative way. Second, to propose an original typology of the numerous Balkan migration crises. And third, to go beyond the crisis, so to compare the crisis, but also the anti-crisis potential of the Balkans. And a small clarification, so the article and the paper is mainly focused on Western Balkans, which means the countries which cover former Yugoslavia geopolitical space, plus Albania. There are also comparisons with Bulgaria and Romania, but it is mainly focused on the Western Balkans because it is more coherent as a geopolitical space. Conceptualizing the crisis. Crisis has a very interesting conceptual history, which could be summarized by a marginal phenomenon, a marginal concept for long centuries, and increasing interest in the crisis in the 20th century. And today it is considered as a mega metaphor of 21st century and the new normality. Next. I have a provocative thesis. If the crisis did not exist, they would have been invented by populist leaders. You see, it is a paraphrase of the famous Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre statement, if the Jews did not exist, they would have been invented by anti-Semitism. So today, populist leaders need the crisis, and especially migration crisis, in such a deep and intimate way in which anti-Semitism needed and needs always Jews. Of course, the question is why to create crisis in a situation where there are already so many crises. It is a huge question, more elaborated, of course, in the paper. In the article, I will briefly touch it also in the presentation. Next. I make a distinction between two types of crisis, and it is very well illustrated by the migration crisis. I would say there is what we could call classic migration crisis, which has very clear, visible, objective indicators, and I will mention the two major ones. The first one are the migration flows. When, for instance, with the Syrian crisis, we had unprecedented after Second World War migration flows, it is an objective indicator of a crisis. The second indicator is also crucial. It concerns policies. It concerns the potential of policies to manage the crisis. If the institutions, they are institutions of reception of refugees, of housing, of education, of labor market, are not ready for these unprecedented flows of migrants, it is also a clear indicator of a crisis. The second type of crisis, I call it post-democratic, but I will not develop here that we could consider as a populist crisis, combines these objective characteristics with the symbolic one. There are several examples. I could take just one from Bulgaria, my country, not even from the Western Balkans, but the situation is the same. So during a summer in a post-Syrian crisis situation, when the migration situation was very calm, there were no migration flows, etc. A populist MP, European Member of Parliament, wrote a letter to the mayor of Sofia that Sofia is invaded by migrants, and you could imagine, let's say, the discourse. And the journalist looking at Sofia did not think any migrants. They asked the Minister of Interior, who was also Deputy Prime Minister, could you provide with some numbers, with some evidence? And the minister provided the evidence that the refugee camps were almost empty, with less than 10% capacity filled in. If I like this example, it is because at that time the Minister of Interior and respectively the Deputy Prime Minister was the leader of the same far-right party, but in his capacity as a minister, he had, let's say, to provide the evidence how false, let's say, this discourse is. So that you see the discrepancy between the populist discourses and the objective situation of the migration flows. So the two types of crises, they differ also in terms of temporality. So for an objective crisis, there is before the crisis, during the crisis, and after the crisis, ante, during, and post. It is much more liquefied in the post-democratic or populist crisis, because they produce those discourses without any reference to the reality. And the major difference is the type of leadership. In the first crisis, it is a public leadership which is expected and aims at managing and resolving the crisis. In the second type, it is political leadership which creates a crisis. Next. How to summarize the very complex migration flows in the Balkans? So I proceed through a very specific zoom. This zoom is the temporality. I take a very famous typology of Fernand Braudel of two types of history, structural, conjunctural, and episodic history, which refer to two types of temporality: longue durée, midterm, and unique contingent events. I apply this typology to the migration profile of the Balkans, and I use it as a theoretical zoom through which to have different images of the migration profile. So the first one is the long term. If we apply this long term, longue durée perspective, we see a migration profile which is of a migration region, and where the type of migration is labor. People migrate for better job, better salaries, and simply having a job. If we apply the midterm perspective, then we are in the heart of the refugee and migration crisis. And concerning contingent events, there are outbreaks of crisis, for instance, so Kosovars or Albanians who at one moment in big numbers leave their country and go for Germany because there was a rumor that they would be welcome, offered a job and social assistance, etc., which was not the case. Next. Again, mission impossible to summarize the different Balkan migration crises for the period beginning of 90s till today. So the first decade of the 90s is characterized by the Balkans becoming the migration champion in negative sense of Europe. At that time, these were the biggest forced migration flows in Europe after the Second World War. They have been provoked, caused by the Balkan wars among the Western Balkans member states, and the origin of the refugees and asylum seekers and the internally displaced persons is the same as the local populations, Bosniak Serbs, Croats, etc. So it lasted more than the war themselves, a very particular period in the history of Western Balkans. After that, so we come to the so-called Syrian refugee crisis, where the Balkans became part of the Western Balkan refugee route, which was open for the refugees. It is the so-called humanitarian corridor, where for a few months they could cross several countries for reaching their final destinations, mainly in Germany, but also in Austria and other EU member states. The origin of these flows is completely different, of course, mainly Syrians, but also other nationalities join. Recently, there are two types of outbreaks. I mentioned when some representatives of the nation the local populations, they live in big numbers, but also there are Afghans, Pakistanis, etc., coming to the region, not for staying there, but again as a transit region to Western Europe, and the populist migration crisis, which is present in several countries with the populist leaders instrumentalizing these refugee flows. Next. So just to change completely the perspective concerning migration and the refugee crisis, especially during the Western Balkans refugee route, Western Balkans, without being a member of the EU, they followed EU guidance, they followed the EU perspective. This route was opened by the EU and was closed by a few months later by the EU. So in a way, EU is the teacher and the Western Balkans are the students in migration management. So I take one opposite example where on managing a very, very specific migration, the teacher is a country from Western Balkans. So this is the case of Kosovo and concerns the very limited but extremely sensible politically and culturally and socially a case of foreign fighters repatriation. So Kosovo is one of those countries which was among the first one to open their doors for the foreign fighters, and all Western countries are observing with the great interest how they apply this policy. Next slide. Too many crises, but let's try to go beyond the crisis. If we try to summarize migration policies in the Western Balkan states, the last decade, a little bit more, probably 15 years, we observe very positive development. The first one is a change of discourse. So instead of speaking all the time of crisis, and crisis is associated with the securitization, with first security policy, but also securitization of migration flows, etc., the discourse changes radically and starts to combine migration with development, with new opportunities. So the political discourse, the policy, it is not political, it is the policy discourse in both the Western Balkans and the EU, working on the Western Balkans integration into the European Union. They conceived the nexus of migration, or mainly diaspora and development, nexus. A few illustrations. So engage, enable, empower is the very nice motto of Albanian policies of engaging diaspora for the development of the home country, because you know, so Albania is one of the countries in the world with a very high percentage of diaspora in relation to the population. This new policy is the major policy innovation in these countries, and it is illustrated by all policy tools. So new legislations, laws, strategies, program for both diaspora and remittances to link them with the developmental goals. Second, second institutional of the new policies with a variety of institutional profiles, so that in some countries even Ministry of Diaspora, like in Albania, in North Macedonia, others Department for Diaspora within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or the relevant ministries, etc. So that a lot of examples, illustrations of this deep policy innovation. Another example, so that so far I discussed mainly diaspora and remittance, but there is another concept and another policy goal, which is to transform mobility among the Western Balkan states as a major driver, first to reconstruction of this post-conflict region, but also for development, the economic, cultural links between these states, which used to be together part of the same Yugoslav state. Next one, I'm going to the conclusions already. So to summarize this very diverse and dynamic picture, I would draw some lessons learned and some conclusions. So the first one is the transition from conflict to from a conflict which is produced within the region, so that the wars among the Balkan states, to conflicts which come from elsewhere, mainly Middle East, Central Asia, etc. So second, the transition from very large flows, for instance, Bosnia lost in a way half of its population, it became internally displaced persons or refugees or asylum seekers, etc., to smaller flows. The third is very interesting. It is the transition from a double migration profile as both sending and receiving region to a transit region. So today, most of the asylum seekers, they transit the region. And this other policy transition from real refugee crisis to constructed, instrumentalized populist migration crisis. Migration dilemma. So how to think and how to manage in a way migration? Should we do it through the prism of crisis, or should we do it through the prism of migration and development nexus? So another dilemma is these two types of crisis, to be able really to make a distinction between real objective based on evidence migration crisis and populist discourses on that. And the second is this, in a way, nice dilemma that instead of conceptualizing and managing migration just in terms of security threat, of risk of conflict, so to conceptualize and to manage it as a major driver for reconstruction and for development and for the prosperity of the Western Balkan regions. And one art end of the whole story, during those migration flows, mainly from Syria, one teacher in Sarajevo, who has never been an artist, who has never been a migration activist or whatever type of activist, she started taking pictures of refugees and posting them on social media, and they became a kind of a sensation. So this very human face of a refugee, especially in a country which only 2 decades ago was a major sender of refugees and asylum seekers to a country as a receiver of refugees. So these very nice citizens perspective on the faces. So she gave faces, she gave life, she gave this art sensibility for the phenomenon. And with this nice art message that migration could be an opportunity and welcoming societies are needed, also because of the memory that the same citizens have been themselves refugees only 2 decades ago. I would like to finish this short presentation.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Actually, this is a very brilliant webinar because you explained us about Balkanian migration crisis, but at the same time, we see in these migration issues also very critical, very universal stuff in migration studies. So from small waves to large waves, at the same time, the securitization and development issues and the shift from securitization to development is very critical. Thank you. And this typology is very critical. Thank you. You share with us about these whole issues.
It was a pleasure. Yes, it was a pleasure. Thank you very much.